In January 2003, the entire music press had already decided what Michael Jackson was. The Martin Bashir documentary had just aired. Every major outlet was running with the same story, a man unraveling in real time, strange and reclusive and completely disconnected from the world most people lived in. Late-night hosts were doing impressions. Tabloids were stacking headlines. The nickname Wacko Jacko had become so common it barely needed explanation anymore. If you turned on a television in early 2003 and Michael Jackson's name came up, the framing was almost always the same. An icon from a different era, living inside a bubble, increasingly hard to take seriously. That was the consensus. The version of Michael Jackson that existed in the public imagination in early 2003 was a caricature drawn so many times it had started to feel like the original. People had stopped asking whether it was accurate. They'd moved on to treating it as settled. And then there was the reality. Chris Tucker had known Michael for years. He knew the guy who would sit in his living room at Neverland, like Michael Corleone, completely still, until two giraffes walked past the window, and he'd look over at you like that was perfectly normal. He knew the version of Michael who would randomly decide to start calling Tucker Christmas one day for no particular reason, and then stick with it for months. He had been on set for the You Rock My World video and kept messing up shots because he couldn't stop watching Michael move. This was not the person the press was describing. The press had a character they were playing. Michael had a whole different life running underneath it. But even Tucker had absorbed some of the public image by osmosis over the years. The Wacko Jacko version had gotten into his head a little, the way ambient noise eventually just becomes what you think silence sounds like. They were somewhere in Los Angeles. Tucker was driving. Michael was in the passenger seat, watching the city go by. At that particular moment in early 2003, there was one song you could not avoid. It came out of open car windows. It came out of every club, every barber shop, every store with a speaker facing the street. It had been produced in a single session. Dr. Dre and Mike Elizondo had built the beat, originally intending it for D12 as part of the 8 Mile soundtrack. D12 passed. 50 Cent heard it, sat down, and had the entire song written in under an hour. He recorded it the same night. It debuted at #1 and had no intention of leaving. The opening line alone, "Go Shorty, it's your birthday," had already started to become the kind of phrase people just said now, the way certain things cross over from songs into the general atmosphere of a year and stay there. "In Da Club" came on the radio. Tucker heard it and immediately started running the math. The lyrics were what they were. Bottles in the club, specific things 50 Cent was not going to do with his enemies. The kind of language you'd expect from an artist whose entire persona was built around having survived 9 gunshot wounds and come back colder than before. Tucker glanced at Michael. Michael was looking out the window at the street. Tucker's hand moved toward the dial. He stopped. Michael was nodding his head to the beat. Not consciously, not as a performance. Just his body responding to something his ears had registered before his brain caught up. Tucker watched him for a moment, genuinely unsure what he was looking at. Then Michael started beatboxing under his breath, finding the drum pattern and mirroring it. The way a person does when they're hearing music, the way engineers hear it, rather than the way casual listeners do. Then Michael started singing the words, in that voice, the voice that had been on more #1 singles than almost any other human being alive, that unmistakable falsetto, now wrapping itself carefully around 50 Cent's opening bars. Tucker lost it completely. "Michael, Michael, no." He was gesturing. "Don't sing the words, please." Michael didn't seem bothered. He paused, turned to look at Tucker with the same even expression he brought to most things and said, "I love that song, Chris. I love that beat. I love it." A pause. "That is a cold-blooded beat. Of course I wouldn't go in the club with a bottle full of bub, Chris. I wouldn't do that. But I love that song." Tucker tried again. "It doesn't sound right, Mike." "I know," Michael said, "but I love it." Here is what Tucker didn't fully understand in that moment, and what the press certainly didn't understand, and what most people still don't consider when they hear this story. Michael wasn't listening to that song the way you listen to something on your way to work. He was listening to it the way a watchmaker looks at a movement through a loop. He was taking it apart to see what made it run. The beat that Dr. Dre built for In Da Club is deceptively spare. His stated philosophy on the track was simple: less is more, but make it feel enormous. What he created was a piece of music with almost nothing in it: a drum pattern, a bass line that moved rather than sat still, a string stab that appeared and disappeared with precision, and yet it occupied a room completely. The bass wasn't playing root notes. It was walking, creating its own melodic line that lived in counterpoint with the chord structure above it. There were barely three harmonic elements on the track, and each one was doing something specific. Nothing was decorating. Everything was load-bearing. Dre once said he didn't want to layer the track with too much stuff and clutter it up. What he left out of the mix mattered as much as what he left in. That kind of restraint is harder than it sounds. Most producers fill space because empty space makes them nervous. Dre let the space work. Michael Jackson had spent his entire career thinking exactly this way. He knew the placement of the kick on Billie Jean wasn't an accident. He had argued for it, specifically, against people in the room who thought it sounded wrong. He knew why the bass on Don't Stop Till You Get Enough moved the way it did. He had spent years in recording studios, not just singing, but sitting with engineers, asking questions, staying until he understood what each individual decision was doing to the emotional weight of a song. He wasn't a spectator in the studio. He was the person who heard a mix and said, quietly, that the hi-hat needed to come down slightly on the third beat, and he was right. And everyone knew he was right as soon as he said it. He was not someone who heard music and received it as a unified whole. He heard the components, all of them at the same time, from the moment the speakers came on. So when In Da Club came on in that car, what Michael was responding to wasn't the lifestyle the lyrics described or the persona 50 Cent was projecting. He was hearing Dr. Dre make a series of very deliberate choices, economic, intelligent choices, that added up to something physically unavoidable, something that moved a human body before the human brain had a chance to weigh in on whether it should. He recognized that quality immediately because he had spent decades in pursuit of exactly the same thing. Billie Jean does that. Thriller does that. You don't plan to respond to them. You already are before you notice. That is a cold-blooded beat. That's not a compliment the way a fan says something is good. That's a diagnosis from someone who understood what it costs to build something like that. Tucker told this story years later in his Netflix special and at the BET Awards, doing the impression, hitting the voice, landing the punchline, and it works every time he tells it because the image itself is just inherently strange and perfect. The image of Michael Jackson in the passenger seat of a car quietly singing 50 Cent in that falsetto is something your brain resists for a half second and then absolutely cannot release. In August 2023, 50 Cent found the clip and posted it on Instagram. His caption was, "Yo, Chris is crazy, who didn't like that one?" Which is exactly the right response, because 50 Cent wasn't surprised. He already knew. What most people don't put together is what happened between Michael and 50 in the years that followed. Michael reached out to try to end 50's ongoing conflict with the game, calling the game directly. He had thoughts about the situation. He was monitoring things. When 50 began working on a major project, it was Michael who pursued the collaboration. 50 Cent later described his reaction to working with Michael in a few words. "I don't usually get nervous because I really don't care about a lot of the artists. But Mike is special. He's different. I don't know how to explain it." They recorded a track together called Monster. Michael died in June 2009 before it could be released properly. It came out in December 2010 on the posthumous album. The point isn't that Michael Jackson liked hip-hop. He'd had Biggie on This Time Around in 1995, back when putting a rapper on a mainstream pop record was still considered a risk. He'd had Criss Cross and Naughty by Nature in the Jam video. He had passed on a Tupac collaboration specifically because he was a Biggie fan and didn't want to be seen taking a side in the East Coast/West Coast divide, which tells you how closely he was tracking everything happening in that world. Michael Jackson was not confused about who 50 Cent was, what Get Rich or Die Tryin' represented, or what In Da Club was doing on the charts. The point is something more specific than that. In January 2003, while every television host was doing the same impression and every tabloid was running the same headline about Michael Jackson being lost and bizarre and out of touch with reality, Michael Jackson was sitting in a car in Los Angeles, hearing a brand new song on the radio and immediately accurately diagnosing why it worked. Not because he was performing open-mindedness, not because he was trying to prove something to Tucker, because music came on and his ear did what his ear always did, which was locate the intelligence behind the construction and respond to it directly. The world had spent months explaining who Michael Jackson was in early 2003. It had his strangeness down. It had his eccentricities cataloged. What it didn't have, and what it never really managed to grasp, was the thing underneath all of that. The actual professional, the one who could hear a Dr. Dre beat through a car radio and understand within seconds what made it move. That person was in the car. Tucker saw him. He didn't fully understand what he was looking at, but he saw him. And the funniest part of this whole story, the part that makes it worth telling, is that the clearest portrait of Michael Jackson's real mind that exists in the public record isn't some rare archival footage or a leaked recording session. It's a comedian doing a voice impression at a Netflix taping, accidentally preserving the most honest 10 seconds anyone ever captured. I know, but I love it. He loved it because the beat was cold-blooded, because Dre had built something that bypassed every mental filter a person had and went straight to the body, because that is the goal. That is always the goal. And Michael Jackson had been chasing it and achieving it and recognizing it in other people's work since he was a child in Gary, Indiana, who could hear something once and never mishear it again. The question worth sitting with is this: if the person the press described in 2003 and the person in that car were clearly not the same person, which one did the world actually know? Drop your answer in the comments. You might find you're not the only one who has had someone else's version of you running around in the world while the real one was somewhere else entirely.